Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses as we continue with Part 8, Strife in the Holy Land, of Along Civilization's Trail, an account of recent experiences in mystic places and strange lands by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC, an article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 15, Number 10, November 1937. Along Civilization's Trail by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. Editor's note: this is the 8th episode of a narrative by the Supreme Secretary relating the experiences he and his party had in visiting mystic shrines and places in Europe and the ancient world. Strife in the Holy Land. War in Jerusalem, the land where the Prince of Peace had expounded his message of hope for humanity, was now ridden by riots and burning with the flames of hatred. Nearly 20 centuries ago, from the same land, went forth the doctrine that a brotherhood of man and goodwill on earth toward all would be the highest manifestation of the divine in man's nature. Today, the authorities in Cairo warned us that we would enter Palestine and Jerusalem at our own risk, for the populace were aligned against each other. Racial and religious prejudices had swept all barriers of reason and tradition away. We thought, as we determinedly signed papers releasing the authorities from responsibility for any possible injury to our persons in Palestine, that it is remarkable how well religion has survived in the face of this blunt reality, promising peace, love, and compassion in a world where on every side reality portrays envy, greed, jealousy, and strife. Still, the illusion goes on. But then, are not many worthy ideals illusions only because they are not possible of actuality under existing circumstances? The illusion exists not in their worthiness, but in the belief that they are possible of attainment in our own lifetimes. The Egyptian press substantiated the dire warning of the railroad representatives. Articles told of troop movements in Palestine, of the concentration of armed forces in Jerusalem, of pillaging and Arab atrocities. As we rode through the night, looking up at the dark blue canopy overhead with its scintillating specks, the tales of war and bloodshed seemed fantastic and distant, like a horrible dream when one awakens in a room bathed in warm, courage-giving sunlight. The press exaggerates, was our self-encouraging thought as we settled down for a monotonous railway journey of a night and a day. Kantara at last. We rose stiffly after our journey of several hours, shook the desert dust from our clothing, feeling much as the nomad must feel who pushes his way across the desert wastes on the back of a camel. Here was relief. We were to ferry across the celebrated Suez Canal, point of international controversy. The coolness of the water would be refreshing. We, freighters Brower and Shibley and I, juggled our luggage through the open compartment windows to jabbering fezzed native porters who eagerly seized it and fought among themselves for the privilege of carrying the pieces and earning a small fee in compensation. A queer spectacle greeted our sight as we trailed behind our porters. The Suez at this point was exceedingly narrow and unimpressive. Its width seemed to us not greater than many of the principal irrigation canals of western United States, except for 3 low-wattage floodlights mounted on slender, obliquely fastened poles, which cast small circles of a yellow haze on the sluggishly moving water. The canal was inky black and free from even the outline of any craft. Parading down a rickety plank ramp, we walked on board the ferry. The ferry was like a continuation of the ramp. The flooring consisted of rough planks, fastened with hand-wrought nails, protruding in many places over which passengers stumbled. The only support on either side was a railing, much like a crude fence, but having only a top bar. The ferry had neither prow nor stern. It was, in fact, but a raft some 35 feet in length and 25 feet in width. The passengers crowded against the railings to permit the lumbering truck the center. While humanity and vehicles were being compressed into the small area, we looked at our fellow passengers. We felt conspicuous. Our garb was so strictly Western. Not another of the perspiring group was attired in a like manner. On my right stood a swarthy native woman with shiny brass earrings and voluminous skirt of brilliant hues. A striped shawl draped her head and partly shaded her darting eyes. On my left was a Bedouin Arab nomad wearing leather sandals, each with its supporting thong tightly drawn between the large and next toes of his broad feet. Covering his gaunt frame was an awning-like linen robe, and hanging from his black rope belt was a dirk, the scabbard of which was inlaid with mother-of-pearl, causing it to shimmer with reflected light. He and many of his kind who crowded us were apparently oblivious to our presence. They dwelt on thoughts not agreeable, for their faces were distorted by scowls. None too pleasant company, I thought, as I recollected tales of hatred which the Arabs were said to harbor for us Occidentals at this time. The pleasing coolness of the air was mitigated by the ravenous mosquitoes and the pernicious, sticky black flies. We felt further uncomfortable, for we were aware that we were now becoming objects of exceptional curiosity to several. It was but a matter of moments before we had crossed the Suez and were aboard the sleeper, which was to take us into Palestine. As I lay listening to the high-pitched shriek, rather than whistle, of our engine as we sped across the peninsula of Sinai, I thought of its ancient copper mines. For centuries, these great mines had provided the pharaohs with the metal so badly needed for implements and weapons alike. All the peoples of the then known world bartered for this Egyptian copper. No one knows how and when ore was first discovered, but it is thought to have been first found on this peninsula in the dim past. Some prehistoric Egyptian, perhaps a late Stone Age traveler, found one morning glistening in the still warm ashes of his fire one or more beads of metal which had gone through the process of smelting in the roaring flames of the night before. Repeated findings of these beads in the remnants of the fire on this peninsula caused him and his companions to experiment with heating the loose surface stone. Such experimentation resulted in eventually learning how to crudely extract the metal from the ore. With that simple discovery, the world advanced tremendously. New accomplishments were possible, for the age of metal had arrived. We rose early to greet the rising sun, tinting the distant eastern hills a delicate shade of pink. The land was desolate, like our badlands of Nevada, table-like, hard-packed with tufts of parched vegetation, with a sprinkling of round pebbles, a little larger than commercial gravel. Not a sign of life was apparent. This vista did not complement our glamorous concept of what the Holy Land should be. The uninteresting view turned our attention to our reading matter, by which we hoped to break the monotony of the ride. Our attention sometime later was drawn from our books to the outside again by a sudden slowing of the train's speed to a crawl. The hills were now closer, very near in fact, and on both sides of us. We were traveling through a narrow valley. The floor of the valley was covered by short grass stubble, still brownish in hue. There before us was what we had expected to see in Palestine, a flock of sheep and herd of goats being driven by a nodding Semitic riding astride a small trotting burro. The bare feet of the shepherd nearly dragged in the dust. It looked as though, if he stood upright, feet on the ground, the burro could have passed easily between his straddled legs. As we looked, more flocks came into evidence, some descending from nearby hills. All seemed to be converging. So slowly had we been traveling for several minutes that the halt of the train was hardly noticeable. Here was the first stop we had made during the day. We left our compartment to crowd in the aisle of the car and leaned far out of the lowered windows. Parallel with the track, for about the length of 2 cars, stretched a board platform open to the sky. 100 yards back of it were 8 or 10 tents, somewhat squattier than our American Indian teepees and less graceful, of a black material which we later learned was tanned goatskin. Aligned in front were small children in the customary tattered clothing of the East, some partly naked. But unlike the children of the Egyptian fellows, these were quiet and almost motionless. Near them were groups of adults, either astride burros or sitting on their haunches. Loud voices and the clatter of heavy boots on the platform caused us to turn our heads in the direction of the rear of the train. There were 2 soldiers, British Tommies. They wore the regulation tropical uniform of the British soldier, khaki shorts and shirt, high socks, trench shoes and tan cork helmet. Each had, slung across his back, an automatic rifle with bayonet affixed. The men themselves particularly attracted our attention. They were, in fact, boys. Neither of the lads was over 19, at the utmost fresh-faced, bright-eyed, the kind of youthful, intelligent face you see in a college sports event, and little expect to find in a military expedition of this kind. An incident occurred in the few minutes of our stay which caused us to lose admiration for them and their superiors. Perhaps it was exceptional, at least we hoped so. An Arab lad, about 16 or 17, sauntered over to the platform with ragged turban, legs and feet bare. Upon his approach, the young Tommies stopped their bantering and watched him. As soon as he stepped upon the platform, they were upon him. Each grabbing one of his arms, they pulled him in opposite directions, then shoved him so violently toward each other that he nearly fell. He was finally pushed off the platform. One then struck him with his open hand across the head as he vainly tried to protect head and shoulders with his arms. Retreating, he never once offered resistance. The other ran after him, kicking him as he fled. We were astounded. Why this brutality? The Arab boy had said or done nothing. Assuming that his presence was a menace to the train because of danger of sabotage, could they not have ordered him away, enforcing their orders with the presence of their weapons? Was Great Britain countenancing such conduct on the part of her troops? Or were these, as their youth indicated, just raw troops unjustly displaying their new authority and might? Such actions, whatever their cause, would only breed further hatred and difficulty in Palestine for Britain, we thought. We rode on in silence for nearly another hour at a snail-like speed. The next stop was at Lida, a larger platform, crowded as the previous one, having a partial rain shed down the center. The hills had closed in on us. Lida was a junction point. Our train was to go to Haifa and the sea. We must change here for Jerusalem. No porters clamored at the windows for our baggage. After quite some labor, we unloaded our assortment of 21 pieces, including the delicate cinema equipment, into a pile on the platform. Our Jerusalem train had not yet arrived. We looked about us. We were in an armed camp, it would seem. One end of the narrow, rough shed was supported by additional posts, and on top of it, behind a rampart of sandbags, a machine gun was mounted, and behind it sat 2 alert Tommies, about the same age as those we had previously seen. From their position, they commanded full view of the rocky cliffs which frowned down upon us. And they were alert, watching for Arab snipers that had been harassing the railroad crews. The platform was crowded with troops carrying full equipment, waiting as we were for the train to Jerusalem. A drone overhead caused us to look upward. There, a lone plane, a scout, circled high over the depot and adjacent hills, ready to signal the troops below of any Arab movement in their direction. We scanned the clefts in the scarred hills. There was no life visible, yet we had the uneasy feeling that eyes from the dark shadows of the hillsides watched our movements. Perhaps sighting at us along rifles they hesitated to fire at the moment. The piercing shriek of the dumpy engine pulling rickety wooden cars towards us was a welcome relief. Our party was separated. We were all fortunate to find space on board. This was a troop train, and passengers, of which we were the only ones, were incidental and their comfort not considered. The troops were all in good humor. They had just arrived on the transport from England and were on their way from Haifa to various zones in the trouble area in the vicinity of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. None was over 21, or so it seemed, with the exception of the officers. We learned that the youthfulness of the troops was due to the fact that England has found that men over 25 years of age do not, unless they have lived for some length of time in the tropics, readily adjust themselves to extremes in temperature. In the aisles outside of the compartments in each car were stationed 4 men, rifles ready and at rest on window bars, as they peered into the hills for signs of Arab hostilities toward the train. On a sharp bend, I saw, through our open window, through which dust and cinders poured, a gasoline truck traveling on the rails about 100 feet in advance of our engine. On it was mounted a rather heavy caliber machine gun, and 3 armed Tommies stood by. This, we learned, ran in advance of the train to ward off attacks on it, and to sight any damaged rails or bridges intended to derail the train, which had been the recent practice in these canyons. The viciousness of the rocky hills through which we were winding was finally broken by patches of vegetation. We were nearing Jerusalem. The sloping sides of the hills were now terraced every 10 or 12 feet, with 3-foot walls made of irregular stones plucked from the surrounding surface. Between each wall and the one above was a thin veneer of soil. In these rims of soil grew the grapes of Palestine and much of the grain and truck which the Holy Land depended upon. In biblical times, the peasant of Palestine found the thin coating of soil on the rocky cliffs hardly sufficient for his actual needs. Centuries of rainfall had washed nearly all the remaining soil away. The land in this vicinity would have been completely impoverished, but for these stone retaining walls built as a last protective measure. Hardy Hebrew women turned from their task of hand cultivation to stare at the train of singing, armed men that passed. We wondered as we looked at their solemn, weather-beaten, dull faces whether they saw in these troops new hope or further disaster for their land and race. We swung suddenly from the open country into the yards of Jerusalem's only depot. Crowds on the platform cheered the troops who detrained with the light-hearted spirit of a crowd of Sunday excursionists. Our only conveyance was an old private car. The Arab taxi drivers were on strike, as were all other Arab employees. The Jews dared not supplant them or operate their competitive enterprises for fear of Arab reprisals, which meant bloodshed for both sides. In consequence, all shops, factories, mills, banks, and industrial places were closed and had been for months. Hunger and disease were rampant, and tension was growing stronger. Outbursts were frequent, loss of life considerable. As we sped at 50 miles an hour along one of the main thoroughfares with a young Hebrew at the wheel, who furtively glanced toward the boarded shop windows on his left and right, we studied the buildings as best we could. Their fronts were plastered and whitewashed, which made them gleam in the hot afternoon sun. They rose to a height of 2 or 3 stories. Many had dome-like roofs and minaret-like towers, revealing the Moorish and Byzantine influence. Others had red handmade tile and wrought iron balconies upon which ordinarily doors opened but which were now boarded closed. This street was macadamized, but side streets, of which we had but fleeting glimpses, were cobblestoned, narrow, crude. Our destination, one of the most prominent hotels in Jerusalem, was gratifyingly modern. After an exceptionally appetizing and well-served meal, we retired. Several times I was awakened during the night by rumbling, indistinct voices and the thud of feet below in the corridors and upon the street beneath my window. Fatigue overcame curiosity, and I would lapse again into sleep. In the morning, we discovered that night had brought about a startling transformation of our hostelry. It had been converted into a military headquarters for the high staff of the British Palestine Expeditionary Force. Uniformed army messengers were running up the broad staircase bearing sidearms. High-ranking officers stood or sat in groups in the main foyer, talking in low voices. All the rooms were occupied by the military staff, and would be, with the exception of those held by our party. An indication of the seriousness of events was the low sandbag rampart on the sidewalk immediately in front of the main entrance, behind which a sentry patrolled. We were allowed free exit and entry, but must return before 8 p.m. or be barred from entry. Each time we desired admittance, we had to secure the permission of the armed sentry. Turning the corner to cross the street to secure the services of a guide whose name had been given us, we saw directly beneath the balcony of our rooms 2 armored trucks, bearing 1-pound cannons and regulation machine guns. These were riot cars which patrolled the streets at night and rushed to areas of disturbance until the arrival of the infantry. A state of war truly existed. "Will we be allowed to film even the historic and mystical places under such conditions?" asked Frater Brower, putting into words my own thoughts. "Probably not," was my pessimistic reply. By appointment, a representative of the office of the American Express Company met us, and after greeting us, he said, "Our office is closed and all ordinary business is suspended. It is a special concession that one meet you here. I cannot assure you any success in your enterprise, for the High British Commissioner of Jerusalem has declared the city under martial law." "Shall we seek to obtain permission to take our cinema pictures?" I asked. "Such channels of authority do not exist at present," he said. "I would suggest that you proceed as usual unless ordered to cease by the military authorities." I suddenly became aware of someone standing close behind me. Somewhat startled, I turned quickly to look into the face of an Arab, bowing graciously to me. He was attired nattily in a business suit, such as any young American or Englishman might wear. The only touch of the Oriental in his attire was his tarbouch, fez. He was a young man of 35. Particularly impressive were his large, expressive eyes and his exceptionally fair skin for one of his race. The extent of his lavish bow and his genial smile caused me involuntarily to bow slightly in return. Noticing our confusion, the American Express representative stepped forward and introduced us. He was to be our guide. "We shall call him Soul, which is not his true name. Not a pleasant prospect, I contemplated, an Arab guide, and we Americans, the next to being English in the minds of most of the peoples of the Levant, and the English were far from being in favor with the Arabs at that time. My musing was interrupted by his question, "Shall we proceed on our journey at once?" Before I could reply, the American Express representative was bidding us farewell and hastily retiring. Turning to Sewell, I answered with a question, "Shall we take our cinema equipment with us now, or just our still cameras?" "Let us investigate the sights now. Therefore take your still cameras. Tomorrow the cinema," he said in his charming accent. In less than half an hour, we were off. Sewell had engaged 2 robust Arab porters to carry our Graflex, tripod, plates, and other paraphernalia. No automobiles being available, we walked, feeling quite uncomfortable in the hot sun. The heat discouraged unnecessary conversation. Our comments were in monosyllables. We stopped before one of Jerusalem's historical and massive triple gates, now but a great stone archway through which pedestrians and pack burros alike tread. Everywhere shop windows were boarded, creating a depressing atmosphere, impressing one with the fact that danger lurked near at hand or was expected momentarily. Natives stood idly, leaning against shop fronts or buildings. To us, they all seemed to be Arabs, solemn, unexpressive, staring into space. Some slowly turned their heads and looked after us. Beggar boys ran up to us, holding out dirty hands, chattering in Arabic, some proffering cakes for sale in filthy straw baskets which had been sitting on the curbs of the gutter, and over which flies hovered, many already covering the wares. The whole scene was, however, picturesque. The remaining portions of the once great walls of King David's temple, the alley-like streets, the roofs of houses on either side leaning until they nearly touched, as though supporting each other in their age of near collapse. Burros were the only means of conveyance, walking patiently, their ears flapping, flies buzzing about their heads, trudging under swaying, cruel burdens. The commercial life of the city, however, was obviously paralyzed, and there were no tourists, no outsiders but ourselves. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.